Model Test 6, Listening Section.
The listening section tests your ability to understand spoken English that is typical of interactions and academic speech on college campuses. During the test, you will listen to conversations, lectures, and discussions, and you will answer questions about them. This is the short format for the listening section. On the short format, you will listen to 2 conversations, 2 lectures, and 2 discussions. After each listening passage, you will answer 5 to 6 questions about it. You will hear each passage one time. You may take notes while you listen, but notes are not graded. You may use your notes to answer the questions. Choose the best answer for multiple-choice questions. Follow the directions on the page or on the screen for computer-assisted questions. Click on Next and then on OK to go on to the next question. You cannot return to previous questions. The listening section is divided into sets. Each set includes 1 conversation, 1 lecture, and 1 discussion. You will have 10 minutes to answer all of the questions for each set. You will have 20 minutes to answer all of the questions on the short format. A clock on the screen will show you how much time you have to complete your answers for the section. The clock does not count the time you are listening to the conversations, lectures, and discussions.
Listening 1, Professor's Office.
Listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
Hi, Dr. Davis. I'm a little early. Should I wait outside?
No, come on in. I'm free. What did you want to talk about?
Well, I've read the first couple of books you had on my list, the reading list for my independent study, and I was just wondering how you want me to report them to you. We didn't really talk about that.
Well, I'm glad you stopped by. Let me think. Didn't you have a project to do in addition to the reading list?
Yes. You said it could be a research paper, or I could come up with a proposal for a different kind of project.
That's right. So the reading list is background information, then. Why don't you just come in when you finish the first part of the list? I think it was divided in 2 distinct parts. So just come in, and we'll talk about the readings.
You mean I should prepare a synopsis of each book and kind of report to you on each one?
No. Nothing as formal as that. I was thinking more along the lines of a conversation. As I recall, the list has a focus, doesn't it?
Definitely. All of the books are novels and plays from the second half of the 20th century.
The postmodern period, then. And all North American novelists and playwrights.
Right.
So we should be able to find some common threads, then. Remember, though, postmodernism is very difficult to define precisely. Maybe we could start with a discussion of the themes that emerge in the collection of literature from that period.
That sounds interesting.
I think so, too. And by the time you get through with the second half of the reading list, and we get together again, maybe we can figure out whether we're looking at a logical extension of postmodernism, or whether there's actually a new movement there in the readings on the second part. If you'll notice, there are quite a few minority writers represented, so you might want to think about what that means.
I noticed that in the list. The first part of the list has the usual North American writers and, of course, a good representation of women writers, as you'd expect. But the second part of the list includes a number of African American authors, several Hispanic American writers,
and a few Asian Americans.
It's a multi-ethnic mix.
Yeah.
Good. So, have you decided whether you want to do a paper or something else, perhaps?
To tell the truth, I'd really like to do something a little more creative. Maybe bring in some visuals on the computer as part of the, I suppose you'd call it a mixed media report. But I've never done anything like that before.
But that's what an independent study is designed to do. It's an opportunity to experiment and to have some one-on-one time with a professor.
But a research paper is easier in some ways. At least I know that I can do a decent job. The computer project's unknown territory.
True, but remember, it's unknown territory for all of us. I think I've heard some references to cybermodernism. If you want to investigate some of the work that's being created in, as you call it, mixed media literature.
Cybermodernism? Wow.
I think you'd find it interesting. Anyway, it's up to you. It's your project.
Thanks. I'm really excited about doing this independent study. Actually, I'm spending more time on it than on any of my other classes.
I've found that students usually invest more time and energy in a class that they can design. That's why I like to direct them. Oh, and Terry, if you run into any problems, don't wait until you're halfway through your reading list. Just stop by during my office hours. Maybe I can give you some references or at least a sounding board.
Thanks. This is better than I even expected.
1. Why does the man go to see his professor? 2. How is the second part of the reading list different from the first part? 3. Listen again to part of the conversation and then answer the following question.
I think I've heard some references to cybermodernism. If you want to investigate some of the work that's being created in, as you call it, mixed media literature.
Cybermodernism? Wow.
What does the man mean when he says this?
Cybermodernism? Wow.
Four. What will the man probably do before the next meeting? 5. What can be inferred about the professor?
2. Environmental Science Class.
Listen to part of a lecture in an environmental science class. The professor is talking about wind power.
Today I want to talk with you about another renewable source of energy, wind power. This isn't a new concept. In fact, wind's been used for centuries to pump water and launch sailing vessels. But more recently, wind power has been used to generate electricity. By the year 2000, California was using maybe 15,000 wind turbines to produce about 400 megawatts of electricity. And that was happening at a cost that would be considered competitive with coal or nuclear power. And although California currently leads the United States in harnessing wind power, there are several other areas that also hold considerable potential for increased production. Texas and the Dakotas alone have enough wind potential to power the nation. But since the winds there are so variable, well, wind power alone would be unreliable as a primary source of continuous energy. Nevertheless, it could be used as a secondary resource, along with fossil fuels. The strong and steady winds of the Pacific Northwest, especially in the Columbia River Basin, these winds would be ideal as a supplement to hydroelectric power when the river's experiencing periods of low water levels. Studies by the U.S. Department of Energy indicate that wind power generated from the Great Plains in the middle of the country could supply the continental United States with almost 75% of the electricity required for the region. In another section of the same report, it was noted that wind powers the world's fastest-growing energy source. Since 1998, the capacity for wind energies increased by more than 35% worldwide. And improvements in wind turbine technology in the past couple of decades has improved efficiency, cutting the cost dramatically from roughly 40 cents to about 4 cents per kilowatt hour. And in new turbine designs being tested with a lower torque so that may actually move the price closer to 3 cents. Europe currently accounts for over 70% of the world's wind power. India, China, Germany, Denmark, Italy, and Spain have published plans for major increases in wind-generated electricity projects in the next few years, and recent interest and exploration have been initiated in the United Kingdom and Brazil. Remote areas, especially islands, and other regions at a distance from electrical grids are vigorously exploring wind options. Clearly, the global implications, not only for cheap energy, but also for clean energy, could be enormous. And in some areas, the consumers are even willing to pay a subsidy for the pollution-free energy that wind provides their communities. In Colorado, for instance, through a program called WindSource, about 10,000 customers pay an additional $2.50 per month for every 100 kilowatt hours of wind power. Legislation in several states in the United States now requires utility companies to guarantee that a percentage of their electricity will be generated from renewable sources like wind power. Of course, there are some problems associated with wind power that do need to be considered. The blades on the turbines present a hazard to migrating birds. In some cases, the vibrations interfere with television reception in the area. And there's been objections to wind farms because they produce noise and because they're not visually appealing to residents nearby. So in addition to the studies to improve turbine design and energy efficiency, some of the attendant problems also require research and development. Regarding the noise, let me mention that design modifications, basically modifying the thickness of the turbine blades and making adjustments to the orientation of the turbines, these modifications have diminished the noise substantially in a number of sites. As for visual appeal, some creative ways to share the land to create a more attractive wind farm are being piloted. So that brings us to the issue of storing wind power. And although wind energy can be stored temporarily as battery power, the real challenge for wind power exploration will be how to level out the energy source. Alternatives for storage will be critical because even in an area with steady winds, wind's still not totally reliable. But the TELUS Institute has released promising results from studies to investigate the problem of intermittent wind. This is what they did. By dividing the wind turbines from one farm into two smaller farms with geographical separation, the capacity of the pair of farms increased by 33.33% over the efficiency of the larger farm with the same number of turbines. So, by taking advantage of the slightly different wind patterns, a more continuous supply of wind power can be generated. So, where are we with all of this? Well, the research that'll make wind power a viable option is underway, but we need to continue to study in order to solve some of the problems before we can use wind power as a primary source of energy globally.
6. What aspect of wind power is the lecture mainly about? Seven. Which two regions of the United States have the greatest potential for supplying wind power? Eight. Listen again to part of the lecture and then answer the following question.
Europe currently accounts for over 70% of the world's wind power. India, China, Germany, Denmark, Italy, and Spain have published plans for major increases in wind-generated electricity projects in the next few years, and recent interest and exploration have been initiated in the United Kingdom and Brazil.
Why does the professor say this?
Europe currently accounts for over 70% of the world's wind power.
9. In the lecture, the professor identifies several problems associated with wind power. Indicate whether each of the following is one of the problems mentioned. Click in the correct box for each phrase. "10. How did the TELUS Institute solve the problem of intermittent wind? 11. What is the professor's opinion about the future of wind power?
'Listening 3. Philosophy class.
Listen to part of a discussion in a philosophy class.
The earliest Greek philosophers, also known as the pre-Socratic philosophers, they were very interested in determining the nature of the universe. Initially, Thales proposed that water was the original material from which all other material was derived, and by that he was referring not only to things on earth, but also in the heavens. He observed that life sprouts from a moist ground, unlike death that dries and shrivels into dust. The fact that water could transform itself into a solid, as it does when it freezes into ice, or it could change into air, as it does when heated into steam, well, this convinced him that everything had originated as water and would eventually return to water. He believed that all things are living things, including rocks and metals, and so literally everything would transform itself into the original material, water, in a logical pattern of change. A little later, Anaximander, and he was a student of Thales, so Anaximander was set on a path that involved questioning which of the elements was the most basic or fundamental. But he suggested that the universe was not originally made up of water, as Thales had reasoned, but was a living mass, which he called the infinite. The word in Greek actually means unlimited, but most translators have used the term infinite since it probably captures the meaning a little better in English. So, Anaximander put forward what some believe is the first theoretical postulate, that the infinite was constantly in motion, up and down, back and forth. So, although the infinite had begun as a whole, the motion had caused pieces to be broken off to form all of the elements of the universe, the earth, the sun, stars. Then, he speculated that as the oceans had begun to evaporate, the first sea plants and animals had formed, and from them, their descendants, the birds and land animals, evolved, until finally mankind was created.
That sounds a lot like evolutionary theory.
Yes, it does. Probably the first instance of evolutionary theory among Europeans, although the Chinese philosophers had discussed this possibility earlier. Okay, so what do you think he postulated about the continued motion of the universe? Anyone?
I remember that part. He thought that all of these separate elements would eventually be put back together into the original infinite mass.
Precisely right. But good students think for themselves, and some years later, Anaximander's student, Anaximenes, criticized his teacher's view. He deduced that the original element of the universe was air, which was timeless and boundless, and in fact, alive. Because mankind and all the animals must breathe air in order to survive, he believed, therefore, that air had been transformed into blood, bone, and flesh. He also concluded that air was the origin of water, stone, and earth, and I think you can see the analogy with the parts of the body there. Furthermore, he contended that the solid condensations of air constituted the body of the world, but the ethereal quality of air constituted the spirit of the world, and it was the spirit that remained alive forever. Now, these three philosophers, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, they were all residents of Miletus, and were very active beginning about 600 years before the Christian era. So, they were called the Milesian philosophers, and they all had different views, but they also had something in common.
Do you mean that they were all materialists? Because they were trying to explain the universe in terms of perceivable elements like water and air?
Good observation. Let's take that a step further. They all attempted to explain the unknown in terms of the familiar, instead of looking to the current mythologies or to a divine presence. And that's what is truly extraordinary about these pre-Socratic philosophers. A naturalistic account of the cosmos was profoundly different from the myths and legends of gods and goddesses that had been the basis for explaining the origin of the universe.
So what do you mean by naturalistic?
I mean that they tried to use scientific arguments, and this marked a very new way of thinking. Unlike the exciting narratives of superhuman beings with the powers to create and change the universe, they proposed that the universe was made up of something very basic, and that it was constantly undergoing natural changes. The Milesians made a major contribution, and they did this by moving beyond the old mythologies and folk tales, and some scholars even suggest that they were responsible for the beginnings of Western philosophy as we know it. Now, when we talk about philosophy, it's important to point out that for many centuries, philosophy was not a separate discipline from other areas of thought and knowledge. In fact, early philosophers were mathematicians, physicists, chemists, and biologists before any of these sciences were identified as separate subjects or fields of study. So the pre-Socratic philosophers were trying to discover a scientific basis for the universe long before the scientific method and the technologies were available to support their investigations. But really, many scholars argue that these philosophers did initiate the process, at least, and the process eventually resulted, years later, as the beginning of the physical sciences. Okay, all of this appears on the surface to be very positive, right? But at the time, many philosophers, as well as ordinary citizens, were feeling much less comfortable with the very sparse tenets of emerging science than they had been with the rich and complicated stories that had explained the universe for them. Remember that this is all before Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato, who were, by then, more able to expand on proto-scientific thought and produce a massive and elaborate scientific alternative to the ancient beliefs.
12. What is the discussion mainly about? (13) Why does the student mention evolutionary theory? 14. Listen again to part of the discussion and then answer the following question.
Do you mean that they were all materialists? Because they were trying to explain the universe in terms of perceivable elements like water and air?
Good observation. Let's take that a step further.
Why does the professor say this?
Good observation. Let's take that a step further.
15. What view did the three Milesian philosophers share? (16) What can be inferred about the early Greek philosophers? 17. Listen again to part of the discussion and then answer the following question.
Okay, all of this appears on the surface to be very positive, right? But at the time, many philosophers, as well as ordinary citizens, were feeling much less comfortable with the very sparse tenets of emerging science than they had been with the rich and complicated stories that had explained the universe for them.
What does the professor mean when she says this?
Okay, all of this appears on the surface to be very positive, right?
Listening 4. Professor's Office.
Now listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
Excuse me, Professor Jones. I was wondering whether I could talk with you for a minute. If you're busy now, though.
Sure, Ann. What's up?
Well, I've been working on my research project. I'm doing it on decaffeinated beverages.
Oh, I remember. That's going to be interesting. How's it going?
Good. I've got all the data, but the report's turning out to be fairly short. It took such a long time to do the research, I thought I'd have a lot more to write about.
Well, how long will it be, do you think?
Probably 5 or 6 pages, and that includes a couple of pages with charts in them.
That sounds about right.
It does?
Yes. Oh, of course, it depends on what you included in the 5 pages. The issue here is whether the research design was well thought out and whether you have all the information in your report that you need to explain what you did, the approach, and the results that you found.
Okay. I have a short introduction. Just a few paragraphs, really. So that's about caffeine. And then I talk about the benefits of decaffeination and several ways to do that.
Uh-huh. What else?
Well, I explain my research design, and that's sort of a problem, too, because I'm not sure whether to make this sound like a book. You know, the way the studies are explained in our textbook, or whether I should just write it up as clearly as I can so that anyone would understand what I did.
I'd go for that option. In fact, why don't you ask a few friends to read it before you turn it in? If your friends get it, that's a good indication that you've explained it well. But if they have a lot of questions, then maybe you need to do some rewriting. And Anne, it's even better if your friends aren't chemistry majors like you are.
Well, I would never have thought of that.
Then I'm glad I suggested it. By the way, did you include references at the end of your study?
Just 2. That's all I used.
Okay, good. Just as long as you cite the references you used.
Well, thanks. This is the first time I've ever done my own research. It was hard because I didn't have any experience, but it was fun, too. I was thinking about trying to get a part-time job as a lab assistant next year.
I think you'd be a good candidate. In fact, why don't you write up a draft of that report, and I'll look it over for you before you hand in the final copy.
That would be perfect. I could bring it in on Monday, since that's when you have your usual office hours. Would that be okay?
Yes, but that'd only give you 1 day before the report's due.
Oh, right.
Okay, then, why don't you bring it to class on Friday?
It'd be great.
And Anne, if you're really serious about that lab assistant position, I can give you some information about that when I see you.
Oh, I can't thank you enough.
Not at all, Anne. You've got a lot going for you. I'm glad to help.
18. Why does the woman want to talk with her professor? 19. What advice does the professor give the woman? 20. What does the professor offer to do? 21. Listen again to part of the conversation, and then answer the following question.
I could bring it in on Monday, since that's when you have your usual office hours. Would that be okay?
Yes, but that'd only give you 1 day before the report's due.
Oh, right.
Why does the professor say this?
Yes, but that'd only give you 1 day before the report's due.
22. What is the professor's opinion of the woman?
5. Biology class.
Listen to part of a lecture in a biology class. The professor is talking about bacteria.
Bacteria is the common name for a very large group of one-celled microscopic organisms that we believe may be the smallest, simplest, and perhaps even the very first forms of cellular life that evolved on Earth. Because they're so small, bacteria must be measured in microns, with 1 micron measuring about 0.00004 inches long. Most bacteria range from about 0.1 microns to about 4 microns wide and about 0.2 microns to almost 50 microns long. So, how can we observe them? I'll give you one guess. Under the microscope, of course. As I said, bacteria are very primitive and simple. In fact, they're unicellular, which means that they're made up of a single cell. We think they probably evolved about 3.5 billion years ago. Some of the oldest fossils are bacterial organisms. They've been found almost everywhere on Earth, including all the continents, seas, and freshwater habitats, and in the tissues of both plants and animals. Well, since they're so prevalent, you might ask, how do they reproduce? Okay, they grow in colonies and can reproduce quite rapidly, in fact, by a process called fission. In fission, the cell, and remember, there's only one in bacteria, one cell. So the cell increases in size and then splits in two parts. Fission's also referred to in your text as asexual budding. Now, you'll also read about conjugation, and that's when two separate bacteria exchange pieces of DNA. So there are two ways that reproduction can occur, but we think that fission's more common. Okay, bacteria were virtually unknown until about 1600, when microscopes were introduced. And at that time, bacteria were observed and classified into three main types according to their shapes. And that classification hasn't really changed that much over the years. So that's what I want to talk about today, the main types of bacteria. The slides that I'm going to show you are enlargements of bacteria that I observed under the microscope in the lab earlier today. Now, this first slide is an example of bacilli. The bacilli are a group of bacteria that occur in the soil and air. As you can see, they're shaped like rods. And if you were to see them in motion, they'd be rolling or tumbling under the microscope. Of course, you can't see that because this is a still visual. But later, when you go into the lab, you'll see that rolling motion in examples of bacilli. These are kind of a greenish blue, but some are yellow. So don't try to identify them by their color. Look at the shape. These bacilli are largely responsible for food spoilage. Okay, the next slide's a very different shape of bacteria. It's referred to as the cocci group, and it tends to grow in clusters or chains, like this example. This specimen's one of the common streptococci bacteria that cause strep throat. Finally, let's look at the spiral-shaped bacteria called the spirilla. This is the spirilla. They look a little like corkscrews, and they're responsible for a number of diseases in humans. But I don't want you to get the wrong idea. It's true that some species of bacteria do cause diseases, but for the most part, bacteria are benign. There's a lot of bacteria in this room, in fact. We all have it on us. They live harmlessly on the skin, in the mouth, and in the intestines. In fact, bacteria are very helpful to researchers because bacterial cells resemble the cells of other life forms in many ways and may be studied to give us insights. For example, we have a major research project in genetics here at the university. Since bacteria reproduce very rapidly, we're using them to determine how certain characteristics are inherited. Okay, now, let me review these three types with you. Cocci are spheres, bacilli are rods, and spirillae are spirals. One of my students came up with a way to remember them. Just try to visualize the first letter in the name of each of the different types. Cocci starts with C, like the shape of half a sphere. Bacilli starts with a straight line on the B, and a rod is straight. Spirilla starts with an S, and that's a spiral shape. If it helps you, use it. In any case, although I want you to know the three major classifications, within these basic groups there are virtually hundreds of variations that make them somewhat more difficult to identify and classify than the rather straightforward specimens that I showed you a minute ago. Because, you see, bacteria can join in chains, clusters, pairs, and sometimes more than one type of bacteria may be found together in a specimen. I think you get the picture. Okay then, in addition to identifying bacteria by their shape, which we now know isn't really a very good method for distinguishing them easily, if we really want to identify what type of bacteria we're dealing with, it's better to study the biochemistry or genetic structure of the specimen. They have one chromosome of double-stranded DNA in a ring, which we can analyze fairly easily.
23. What aspect of bacteria is this lecture mainly about? Which of the following slides contain cocci bacteria? 25. Which two characteristics are common in bacteria? (26) Why are bacteria being used in the research study at the university? (27) How does the professor help the students to remember the types of bacteria? (28) Listen again to part of the lecture and then answer the following question.
Because, you see, bacteria can join in chains, clusters, pairs, and sometimes more than one type of bacteria may be found together in a specimen. I think you get the picture.
Why does the professor say this?
I think you get the picture.
Listening 6. Literature class.
Listen to part of a discussion in a literature class.
Today, we're continuing our discussion of Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. We left off last session at the point where Gulliver began his fourth voyage as the captain of a merchant ship. As you'll recall, his crew had confined him and cast him ashore on an island. While making his way along a road, he was attacked by a herd of deformed beasts with brown skin and no tails. But suddenly, the attack was interrupted by the appearance of a beautiful horse. And this is where we left off. So what happens next?
Well, another horse comes along, and they appear to be having a conversation. The two horses, I mean. And they keep using the words Yahoo and Houyhnhnm. So Gulliver is able to understand that Yahoo refers to the animals that attacked him, and Houyhnhnm refers to the horses. Then Gulliver goes home with the horses.
And what is Gulliver thinking about while he's observing the Yahoos and the Houyhnhnms?
Oh, this was good. He starts to understand that the only difference between himself and the Yahoos is his clothing. But he's horrified by this. So we see him trying to be more like the horses.
How do you know that he's striving to emulate the Houyhnhnms?
Well, he learns their language so he can communicate with them.
Right. So this brings us to the most important part of the narrative, the comparison between the Yahoos and the Houyhnhnms. First, tell us how the Yahoos are portrayed. What do they eat? How do they look?
Well, I think the author used the word depraved several times. They eat dog and donkey meat and even garbage, and they drink too much. And he says they're filthy and they stink.
So their behavior, the Yahoos' behavior, is neither rational nor moral. Now take a look at the description of the Yahoos that Gulliver has known in England. Let me refer to the book here. Okay. Gulliver explains that Yahoos in England fight wars for religious reasons, that lawyers use reason to argue for the wrong side, that the wealthy live to acquire more luxuries, and that greed makes them ill. By this we assume that he's referring to the rich gourmet diet that causes gout and other health problems among the upper classes. So this is in contrast with the Houyhnhnms, right? How so?
Yes.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that they eat oats, bread, and honey, but not meat, not other animals, and they don't drink.
I think it's important that they don't even understand the concept of a lie. That proves that they have a very innocent nature.
Good point. You're referring to the fact that they failed to grasp how the crew was able to initiate the mutiny that brought Gulliver to their island.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what do the Houyhnhnms think about Gulliver? And what does Gulliver conclude about himself?
Well, Gulliver isn't really a Yahoo, and he isn't really a Houyhnhnm either. I'd say he's kind of in the middle, but he's trying to become a Houyhnhnm. When he goes back to England, he's actually afraid of other humans. I mean, Yahoos.
But he can't quite achieve his transformation, can he? even though his pride motivates him to continue the impossible pursuit of perfection. So what does this all mean?
I think it's like the other chapters. The fourth voyage it's another critique of the weaknesses in human nature.
Then Swift's making the point that although humankind is capable of rational behavior, we seldom choose to exercise it. The very meaning of the word Yahoo in the Houyhnhnm language is evil. So Swift's very satirical then. And when we consider the time period for the book, the early 1700s, we must appreciate the exceptional departure from the literature of the era, which was mostly written to flatter or entertain. Swift used satire to provide the reader with a perspective that's very different from that of other writers in an age of science and reason.
29. What is the discussion mainly about? (30) What does Gulliver learn about himself? 31. In the discussion, the professor describes the characteristics of the Yahoos. Indicate whether each of the following is one of their characteristics. Click in the correct box for each sentence. (32) Listen again to part of the discussion and then answer the following question.
But he can't quite achieve his transformation, can he? Even though his pride motivates him to continue the impossible pursuit of perfection. So what does this all mean?
Why does the professor say this?
So what does this all mean?
(33) According to the professor, what kind of book is Gulliver's Travels? (34) What can we infer about the literature of the period? Model Test Speaking Section.
The speaking section tests your ability to communicate in English in an academic setting. During the test, you will be presented with 6 speaking questions. The questions ask for a response to a single question, a conversation, a talk, or a lecture. The prompts and questions are presented only one time. You may take notes as you listen, but notes are not graded. You may use your notes to answer the questions. Some of the questions ask for a response to a reading passage and a talk or a lecture. The reading passages and the questions are written, but the directions will be spoken. Your speaking will be evaluated on both the fluency of the language and the accuracy of the content. You will have 15 to 20 seconds to prepare and 45 to 60 seconds to respond to each question. Typically, a good response will require all of the response time, and the answer will be complete by the end of the response time. You will have about 20 minutes to complete the speaking section. A clock on the screen will show you how much time you have to prepare each of your answers and how much time you have to record each response.
Number 1. Listen for a question about a familiar topic. After you hear the question, you have 15 seconds to prepare and 45 seconds to record your answer.
In your opinion, what are the characteristics of a good son or daughter in a family? Use specific examples and details to explain your answer.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 2. Listen for a question that asks your opinion about a familiar topic. After you hear the question, you have 15 seconds to prepare and 45 seconds to record your answer.
Some people are attracted to jobs that include a great deal of travel. Other people prefer jobs that allow them to return to their homes every evening. Which type of job opportunity would you prefer, and why? Use specific reasons and examples to support your opinion.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 3. Read a short passage and listen to a talk on the same topic. Then listen for a question about them. After you hear the question, you have 30 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
The professor's attendance policy is published in the course syllabus. Read the policy in the course syllabus. You have 45 seconds to complete it. Please begin reading now. Now listen to a student who is talking with friends about the policy.
On the one hand, it's good that you can be absent once without explaining why. But on the other hand, you can't be absent more than one time without getting a lower grade. So I'd rather have the option of explaining my problem to the professor if I need to be absent, and then try to figure out a way to make up the work. Look, if I'm sick for 2 weeks, I don't think it's fair for the professor to lower my grade as long as I keep up with the class. Or if you have a legitimate reason not to be there, like a family emergency or something, I don't think you should have to choose between your health or your family and your grade in the class.
The student expresses his opinion of the professor's policy for excused absences. Report his opinion and explain the reasons that he gives for having that opinion.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 4. Read a short passage and then listen to part of a lecture on the same topic. Then listen for a question about them. After you hear the question, you have 30 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now read the passage about insects. You have 45 seconds to complete it. Please begin reading now. Now listen to part of a lecture in a biology class. The professor is talking about insects.
Strictly speaking, a spider isn't an insect. True, it's an invertebrate and an arthropod, but it belongs to a class identified as arachnids. Arachnids are not included in the insect world because their body structure is very different. The bodies of spiders are divided into two parts: a head with a fused thorax, which is all one structure, and the second part is a separate abdomen joined to the large head-thorax part by a narrow stalk. The head contains what many researchers now believe is a highly developed brain. There are no antennae, but 4 pairs of eyes and 8 legs covered with fine, sensitive hairs more than compensate for the absence of the antennae. These hairy legs and feet explore the environment, sending sensory messages back to the brain. Okay, the abdomen. Remember, that's the second part of the spider. It includes not only the digestive and reproductive systems, but also the silk glands that allow spiders to spin their webs. So, as you see, even though spiders and insects are commonly grouped together as bugs, they're really not the same. An oversimplification is that spiders have too many legs and not enough wings. In reality, the entire body structure is quite different.
Describe the structure of an insect and explain why a spider is not strictly considered an insect.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 5. Listen to a short conversation. Then listen for a question about it. After you hear the question, you have 20 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now listen to a conversation between a student and his friend.
Can you believe that I've been here almost a whole semester and you're the only friend I've made?
No. How can that be?
I don't know. You know me better than anyone here at school. I thought maybe you could give me some advice.
Sure. Well, do you belong to any clubs or any organizations on campus? That's always a good way to meet people.
No, I don't have a lot of time to, go to meetings.
Well, neither do I, but I do play intramural sports.
What's that?
It's just a group that meets regularly to play basketball. Of course, there are lots of other teams besides basketball, I mean. You could join a football team or soccer, baseball, volleyball. Just go over to the recreation center and sign up. They'll put you on a team. You could use some time away from the books.
I'd like to do that, but...
Well, since you don't want to take time away from your studies, why don't you join a study group or get one going in one of your classes? That way you wouldn't feel like you're wasting time. And besides, the people you meet will be serious students, so maybe they'd be better friends for you anyway.
Describe the man's problem and the 2 suggestions that his friend makes about how to handle it. What do you think the man should do, and why?
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 6. Listen to part of a lecture. Then listen for a question about it. After you hear the question, you have 20 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now listen to part of a lecture in a psychology class. The professor is discussing the Skinner box.
There have been several references to the Skinner box in your textbook because a lot of behavioral modification experiments still use similar devices even today. So let's just take a few minutes and make sure that everyone understands exactly what a Skinner box is and how it works. The box, which was named for B.F. Skinner, the American psychologist who developed it, it was used in Skinner's original experiment in 1932. And its construction hasn't changed much from that time. It's just a small, empty box, really, except for a bar with a cup underneath it. So picture this. In Skinner's experiment, a rat that had been deprived of food for 24 hours was placed in the box. As the animal began to explore its new environment, it accidentally hit the bar, and a food pellet dropped into the cup. The rat ate the pellet and continued exploring for more food. After hitting the bar 3 or 4 times with similar results, the animal started hitting the bar with intention instead of by accident. It had learned that it could get food by pressing the bar. In other words, the food stimulus reinforced the bar-pressing response. So, many psychology experiments were modeled after Skinner's original research. Various animals have been placed in modified Skinner boxes and presented with conditions that will result in a reward, food or some other desirable object or experience. In most of the behavior modification experiments in your book, you'll see a citation for Skinner's classic study.
Using the main points and examples from the lecture, describe the Skinner box. and then explain how the device is used in psychology experiments.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Model Test 6, Writing Section.
First, read the passage and take notes. Now listen to a lecture on the same topic as the passage that you have just read.
Unfortunately, I don't see a convincing theory among the three presented in the reading. Let me explain. Two problems cast doubt on the fission theory. When put to the test, models show that a force capable of breaking off a chunk of the Earth the size of the Moon would have destroyed the entire planet instead of sinking into the ocean. Also, an inspection of lunar rocks collected during the Apollo missions convinces us that the Moon was once hotter than the Earth. So you see, fission would have been pretty much impossible. And another issue, the rocks themselves have a different chemical composition from that of the Earth's crust. Now let's look at co-accretion. Remember that this hypothesis assumes that the Moon and the Earth came into existence at the same time, but here's the problem with that. Gravitational forces would probably have fused them together, or they would share more characteristics than they do. I mean, how do we explain the relatively small iron core of the Moon at only 25% compared to the much larger iron core of the Earth at 50%? Which brings us to the impact hypothesis. Let's say, for purposes of argument, that the planet that crashed into Earth, the one about as big as Mars, let's say that happened, and the debris from both planets orbited the Earth and eventually created the Moon. But if there was debris, then why didn't it form a group of moons, as would be predicted, instead of just one moon? And why didn't the moon rocks show evidence of the kind of biochemical processes we would expect, the kind that would accompany extreme evaporation from a massive collision? So, from my point of view, and quite a few of my colleagues would agree with me, well, we just need to keep looking because none of our current theories are adequate.
Summarize the main points in the lecture, and then explain how they cast doubt on the ideas in the reading passage.
Model Test Answers.
Example answer for independent speaking question 1. A good son or daughter.
The role of a good son or daughter changes over the years. Initially, being an obedient child's probably all that a parent requires. But when a child grows up and begins to become independent, then a good son or daughter is a person who has good character, who does well in school or succeeds in a career and demonstrates the personal qualities that the parents have tried to teach. A good son or daughter is also a good parent when they have children of their own. When parents see their grandchildren being brought up well, they know that they've provided a good example. And when the parents become old and need care, a good son or daughter won't be too busy to spend time with them and provide them with help.
Example answer for independent speaking question 2. Job opportunities.
Although a job that involves travel seems glamorous to people who spend day after day in an office, It really isn't for me. For one thing, traveling for business usually means going to the same places repeatedly and staying in the same tired hotel rooms. Besides that, the pace of a business trip doesn't allow much time to see anything besides the inside of an office building and the road to the airport. And eating in restaurants isn't that healthy, and traveling all the time is exhausting. No, I'd rather have a job opportunity that would let me sleep in my own bed and eat my own cooking. But ideally, the job would also include a 3-week paid vacation, so I could travel to a destination of my choice and relax.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 3. Excused absence.
According to the professor's policy, students can be absent from one class without explaining unless there's a test scheduled. And then the professor expects students to go to her office to give her an explanation for being out of class and arrange for making up the test. Also, being absent more than once could mean that your grade could be lowered by 1 letter for each time you miss class. The student doesn't agree with the excused absence policy because he thinks that his grade shouldn't be affected by absence if he makes up the work. From his point of view, a valid reason for absence, like an emergency, a family problem, or illness, that shouldn't jeopardize his grade unless he fails to keep up with the class or his work's unsatisfactory.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 4. Insects.
Insects are arthropods with a 3-part body structure: a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. The head has a pair of eyes and a pair of antennae, and 3 pairs of legs and 2 pairs of wings are usually attached to the thorax. Now, although a spider is also an arthropod, it isn't considered an insect because it only has a 2-part body structure. The head and the thorax are joined together on a spider and attached to its abdomen by a thin stem. And a spider doesn't have antennae, but it does have 4 pairs of eyes. Instead of 6 legs, it has 8 hairy legs that are used kind of like an insect uses its antennae to explore the environment. A spider doesn't have wings. It has a unique glandular system that allows it to spin its webs. So, because of this very different body structure, a spider is not really an insect.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 5. Meeting people.
The man's problem is that he hasn't been very successful meeting people and making friends. He's been on campus for an entire semester, and the woman's the only friend he has. She suggests that he participate in some clubs, but he's reluctant to spend the time required for meetings. The woman plays intramural basketball. She says that there are a lot of sports options at the recreation center. Another possibility that she recommends is for the man to join a study group. That way, he'd meet some serious students, and he'd still be using the time to study for classes while he was getting to know people. I think that the man should join a group to play sports for an hour, twice a week, because he probably needs the exercise, and he should also try to get into a study group, because he'll probably have more in common with the people who are using their time to study for their classes.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 6. Skinner box.
A Skinner box is a small box that's empty except for a cup and a bar. When the bar over the cup's depressed, a food pellet drops into the cup. An animal that's placed in a Skinner box will explore the environment for food and at some point will accidentally hit the bar, releasing the pellet. So, after the animal hits the bar about 3 or 4 times and it's rewarded with food, then it learns how to find food using the bar, and it begins to hit the bar on purpose. The Skinner box, or something like it, it's commonly used in psychology experiments that involve behavior modification. By presenting a subject with the opportunity for a reward, the behavior that produces the reward is reinforced. In the case of the classic experiment, the subject's opportunity for a reward is a food pellet, and the behavior that's reinforced is pressing the bar. But many types of rewards and behaviors have been used.